So in addition to that, we think of the menstrual cycle as only being related to when we want to have children. And so even this concept of if you're wanting birth control, just go on the pill suppresses ovulation. So basically shuts down your normal menstrual cycle and it replaces it with a fake one because you're not really having a true menstrual bleed when you're on a cyclical pill formulation. What happens when you withdraw the hormones for the 5 days or 7 days, the sugar pill week or whatever, you're having a withdrawal bleed because the artificial hormones were consistent and then you took them away and then your body kind of tries to reset itself and then you take them again. So we think, okay, well, if I don't want to have a baby, I just shut down my menstrual cycle and that is going to the only effect it's going to have on me is that I won't be able to get pregnant. If we think of our menstrual cycle as a vital sign, then all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense.
Hi, I'm Lauren Parsons.
And I'm Andy Jackson, and this is the All Well Co podcast.
Dive deep with us as leading experts share their unique perspectives on topics such as recovery, sleep, movement, and the latest innovations in the space.
Lisa, it's so wonderful to have you on the All Well Co podcast. Before we get started and dive into your journey, I want to set the stage a little bit. So can you share how we first met and a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, I first discovered fertility awareness at a young age. So looking back, I think it was supposed to be this way. Um, the story can be long, so I'll try to give you the brief version. But for my very first period, it was painful. It was heavy. And being a child, being a teenager, I was looking for a way to deal with that. So I had my mom take me to the doctor and I had 3 words out of my mouth and he was already writing the prescription for the pill. And when I started taking the pill, I was not sexually active. And so my pill periods were easier to manage. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm fixed. We're good. So I would come off of it periodically because I wasn't using it for birth control, but my actual heavy, painful periods would actually come back. So from a young age, I didn't have the language to describe what a pill bleed was or, all of that kind of thing. But I did know that whatever the pill was doing wasn't actually fixing this issue that I seemed to have. And so when I actually did need birth control, I decided to come off the pill. I wanted to figure out what's going on. I wanted to see what was going on with my cycles. And that was right around the time I discovered charting. So I have been charting my cycles since I was in my late teens, and I was teaching women to chart in my early 20s, very grassroots level. A group of us took a training together. And, fast forward to when I was in my late 20s and I got married, my husband and I decided to start our family. It was around that time that I really realized how big of an issue this was because I had a very unusual experience. I had learned about my cycle. I had avoided hormonal birth control for the majority of my reproductive life. And when my husband and I were ready to conceive, we just sorted it out because we knew the days and there wasn't much of a challenge there. But then when I was looking around, this was not the case for most women. And even though I had had that knowledge for so long, the average woman still to this day has never really heard of half of this information. So that is the long and short of kind of why I started, my podcast in 2014 before anyone was talking about fertility awareness in podcast form. And I'm really happy to have connected with Lily early on. She was one of my very first guests in the podcast. And when she was writing Real Food for Pregnancy, I was writing my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign. And so that was one of the reasons why we came together. We're very good friends. We're very dear friends. And we wrote our other books together. And we really felt like we needed one resource to put this information together. So
Yeah,
very interesting how it all came together.
that's great. And I want to go back to one thing you said. How did you know to chart? You said, you got into charting. What did you do to dive in to realize that was what you needed?
What is charting?
And what is it?
Yes.
Yeah, what is charting?
I told you I gave you a Cliff Notes version. So
Yeah.
I was in university first year and there was a speaker and she was talking about her book. And her book wasn't specifically about charting your menstrual cycle, but she was kind of a poet and she did this kind of interesting, funky kind of presentation. But in there, she talked about how she learned that she could identify her fertile window and predict when her period was coming and all this stuff. And so we had a women's center on our campus and they were the ones kind of putting on some of these events and they were doing different educational things. I remember I learned about how toxic the chemicals were in tampons and all this stuff. And so they directed me to Taking Charge of Your Fertility by Toni Weschler. So I like basically hightailed it to the bookstore, got her book, read it. I was totally enthralled and I started charting. And what charting is just tracking the main fertile signs, which typically are the cervical fluid observations, your basal body temperature, and then your cervical position. And so that, started a whole journey. I started charting independently based on just reading her book. And then I quickly connected with a group of women on my university campus. This is why I say it was kind of meant to be, because I don't know how many people have this experience, but there was a group of women, some of whom were instructors, some of whom were training to be instructors, and they had a monthly group that they would meet every month and they would teach women to chart. So I started attending and then very quickly became an organizer. And then that was where a group of us took a training together. And so we were leading these in coffee shops, we were leading these trainings on charting when I was in my early 20s. And I graduated from high school in the year 2000. So this is like early to mid 2000s, right? So
Mhm.
far before there were even the Facebooks and the social medias and all of the things. So it's very different now. Obviously, there's a lot more um, there's a lot more visibility than there was back then.
It's really interesting this because we were chatting about this earlier. 'Cause I'm actually quite nervous about this podcast, and it's just because I'm a man. And it's just purely as being a man about this. And I want to just be honest with you is that being a man is that, I'm a slightly older male. Let's just put it compared to yourself. So back in the day, the only time we would ever talk about women being on a period was in a negative. It's the wrong time of the month. She's got a crazy attitude at the month. I'm staying away from her, etc. It's a very male, masculine, negative view about it. So I'm quite fascinated. Well, which is why I asked what is charting. I had no idea around this. And I'm hoping that other men are inspired to listen to this, to actually understand this and appreciate the science behind it, the thought behind it, etc. So I want to go back to you started to get into this.
Can
So
I, before
yeah,
you do that, can I
yeah,
just comment on that real quick?
yeah, please.
Because I mean, I really like, thank you for sharing that. I think that that's really just wonderful for you to just share how you were feeling about it. And I just wanted to let you know that because I've been in the field for a really long time, obviously I've spoken to a lot of men and I'm not fazed when I'm speaking to a man about this at all. And the reason for that is because, I mean, all of the men I know have sisters, maybe they have
Yeah.
wives, cousins, mothers. And so I've found that men are very sympathetic, very curious, very interested, and very overall supportive. So I just wanted to share that.
No, good. That's actually really good. That makes me feel even better for us dealing with a topic like this on this podcast. I want to go back to that. You were talking about that pivotal moment or your personal health experience that shaped your mission. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, like I said, my very first periods were painful, and my mom had different challenges. I wrote about that a little bit in my first book, but she had fibroids and very, very heavy periods, but no pain. So I had all this pain and she was kind of limited in her because she's kind of like, I don't know, who was pain in the family? Like what's going on? And I mean, I was in ballet and there, leotards are involved and really active in sports and stuff like that. So I just needed to find a way to manage it, but there was no information. So that was kind of the first part of my journey. And when I was about 10 or 11, my mom ended up getting a hysterectomy because of her fibroids. Because when she would have her period, it was like a whole situation. She would put like a tablecloth on the couch and lay down. And, even though she was wearing the really heavy pads and things like that, some of it would still come down her leg and stuff like that. I'm just being honest. And there's a reason why I'm sharing this. When she had her hysterectomy, then my aunt, her eldest sister, came to visit. And so I was privy to these adult conversations. And I remember my aunt sharing something similar. Like she was wearing I call them torpedo tampons and like a giant pad. And she went to work. And by the time she was at work, someone was like tapping her on the shoulder, telling her, So being that my mother and my aunt had this same issue and it was very significant, I remember thinking, I don't want to have the same outcome because both of them had hysterectomies. So even when I was coming off the pill at whatever the age that was, like 17, 18, because I graduated high school at 17 just because I'm a November baby, I was already having these thoughts of like, I don't want wanna end up with a hysterectomy, like, if I can help it, I don't wanna have a fibroids that's the size of a grapefruit, I don't wanna but I didn't know any information. So I just started with what I knew, and the first thing I knew was that, okay, the pill is not actually fixing my cycle because every time I come off of it, the pain is just as bad. And so then I came off the pill and started charting and then just had to kind of deal with the pain, and it was pretty bad. And then when I was charting, what I didn't mention is at some point my charting instructor looked at my charts, and so when I first started charting, my cycles were on average about 35 to 40 days or so, which is on the longer end. But I had read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, and in that book, she talked about short cycles and long cycles. And I was like, "Oh, I just have long cycles. I'm Lisa and I have long cycles. This is great." So then I'm charting in this group, and my charting instructor, she looks at my cycle and she's like, "Lisa, your cycles are too long. Your temperatures are too low. You should go get your thyroid checked." And that moment changed everything for me. I feel like that's one of the moments that is why we're here today, because
Really?
I was like, what do you mean? You can tell I have a thyroid issue by looking at my cycle. So, this whole concept that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, that was a really pivotal moment for me, because it turned out I did have a subclinical issue with my thyroid. And over time, I was able to figure out, I went to a doctor. I told him that my cycles were long and what can I do? And he just told me I should go on the pill. I did get diagnosed, like I made them do an ultrasound on me to see if I had fibroids. As I told you this whole story, I do, but they never really grew. I ended up, now I'm older than my mom was when she had her hysterectomy, I think. And so
Yeah, this one I've had experience of recently. Personally, I've gone through my family hysterectomy, pineapple size or grapefruit size, fibroids, etc. So that one I understand. Okay, so looking back, you've started to share some things you didn't know. You've kind of said. So, what were some of the biggest myths you yourself had to unlearn?
in terms of charting, one of the biggest ones is that we can get pregnant every day of our cycle and there are no safe days. So that was when I learned to chart my cycle. You learn that you can track your different fertility signs. I mentioned cervical fluid. So typically in a healthy cycle, you're making cervical fluid as you approach ovulation for an average of about 2 to 7 days. And from a scientific standpoint, the fertile window is about 6 days. So the 5 days leading up to ovulation plus ovulation, because when you have that cervical fluid, the sperm can survive in your body and your reproductive tract for about 5 days or so. So I remember when I first learned that, and that was exactly the opposite of everything that I had learned before. But what it meant for me was that because I had decided to come off the pill, like I said, because I had these concerns about my health and fertility, and I just really didn't want that to be my outcome. I wanted to try to figure it out, even though I had no knowledge. You could just tell how idealistic I was as a young person. Like, I have no idea how to do this, but I'm going to figure this out. But yeah, so that was a big one. And it was so fascinating to dive into the science of charting. And first of all, to read it and to see it in print. I always talk about these three levels with my clients, like these three levels of understanding. So the first level of understanding is when you just read the science and you understand what it's saying. You understand that the days of fertility, you can track your fluid, cervical fluid. And when you get into the fertility awareness for birth control information and you learn about the birth control rules, I mean, there's a lot of research papers on it. So you identify your fertile window with mucus and with temperature. You identify the last day that you have clear, stretchy cervical fluid, and you always add a buffer at the end of it. When you're charting your temperature after ovulation, you produce progesterone, and that's really the only time of the cycle that you're producing significant progesterone. And when you ovulate and you start producing progesterone, it has a thermogenic effect on the body. So when you're taking your temperature, the temperature actually rises and stays high. And so you have these biomarkers that you can track. You can confirm ovulation, when you're in that fertile window. And so all of a sudden, I had so much more control. I felt like I had so much more control. And the biggest shift was that I wasn't afraid anymore. When they
Okay.
tell you you can get pregnant every day of the cycle, but they don't explain anything about the cycle, they just tell you that this is how it is, then you're just afraid. I think, especially for the younger generation, they are now being told that if they're not on hormonal birth control, I feel like they're being told that condoms don't even work. So I feel like the younger generation are even more afraid. But you're afraid, but they never told you how it worked.
Well,
Yeah.
they're not having sex anymore, is all the research I hear. Is all the young people, especially the boys, they're all in the basements playing computer games, is what I've heard.
I could see that. Or, yeah,
Anyway, that's for a different podcast.
yeah.
Yeah. So you've mentioned it, and with your book, you describe the menstrual cycle as the fifth vital sign. So, why do you think this framing is important?
Well, for a lot of reasons. I mean, a vital sign is a sign of how the body is functioning. So if we think about something like your body temperature or your blood pressure, if your doctor takes your blood pressure and it's too high or if it's too low, it not only provides general information that there's something we should be looking at, but the doctor would know if it's low, these are some of the reasons why it would be low, and then that could lead to further investigation. So I think the framing is important because for a lot of us as women, even Andy, what you were saying before about, I had this understanding of the menstrual cycle and it was all negative and avoid her on that week and all of that. So, in addition to that, we think of the menstrual cycle as only being related to when we want to have children. And so, even this concept of if you're wanting birth control, just go on the pill suppresses ovulation. So, basically shuts down your normal menstrual cycle and it replaces it with a fake one because you're not really having a true menstrual bleed when you're on a cyclical pill formulation. What happens when you withdraw the hormones for the 5 days or 7 days, the sugar pill week or whatever, you're having a withdrawal bleed because the artificial hormones were consistent and then you took them away and then your body kind of tries to reset itself and then you take them again. So we think, okay, well, if I don't want to have a baby, I just shut down my menstrual cycle and that is going to the only effect it's going to have on me is that I won't be able to get pregnant. If we think of our menstrual cycle as a vital sign, then all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense. If you look at the side effect profile of the pill, for example, if the only thing our menstrual cycle was for is just for having babies, then we wouldn't see women having, depression and anxiety and the libido and nutrient deficiencies. That wouldn't make any sense because if it was only about conception, we wouldn't be expecting to see any of these other effects. But if we acknowledge that for women of reproductive age, the menstrual cycle is actually a part of our bodies, it's part of how we were actually designed, and it affects other areas of functioning, then all of a sudden, like I said, it makes a whole lot more sense. And it also provides a bit of a roadmap. I mentioned that if you get your blood pressure measured and it's too high or too low, we know what's going on. Well, if you're tracking your menstrual cycle and you understand what a normal cycle looks like, and if a normal cycle is supposed to be falling somewhere between 24 and 35 days, and your cycle is 52 days, or you don't have a cycle altogether, when women have those situations and they go to their doctors, they're usually told to go on the pill and that's it. That's the end of the conversation. But if we really look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and say, well, wait a minute, if she was healthy, her cycle should be falling within these parameters. So what's going on? Why is her cycle 52 days? Why is she not having a cycle at all? And I mean, there's answers to those questions.
Mhm.
One of the common reasons that women have irregular cycles, it could be due to something like PCOS, which is characterized by insulin resistance or glucose intolerance. And women in that situation have double the lifetime risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It's obviously connected to a health issue that we should be aware of. If a woman of reproductive age stops cycling altogether, if she has a situation like hypothalamic amenorrhea where she's under eating or over exercising, if she stops menstruating for 6 months or more, she has a lifetime greater risk of osteoporosis. So we actually do know in the research and then the science that there is a connection between the menstrual cycle and health. It's just that this is not the way that our typical practitioners are trained. They're not trained to think of it that.
Yeah. I was a little lucky in college in that we had practitioners and trainers that were actually a little bit heads up on it, at least as far as the female athlete triad goes, right? When we get into osteopenia and not having a cycle and things like that. And so we were thankfully made aware of things like that, which was, super beneficial, right? But it just, I feel lucky that I was maybe one of the few that learned at least some bits and pieces earlier on.
I wish it was like that everywhere. I mean, there's so much. The one thing that we don't necessarily in some ways we do lack research, of course, but in many ways there is quite a bit, at least for us to go on. And
Sure.
one of the things that can happen, as you know, in those kind of sports settings is it can be kind of normalized that if the cycle's, irregular,
Right.
women are just encouraged to go on the pill. So it's really exciting that you did not have that experience.
Right, right, especially for endurance athletes, I know. So, for everybody listening, would you mind going through what the main phases of the cycle are and hormonally what's happening in each of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can kind of loosely I mean, you can divide the cycle into 4 phases, but for the purpose of this conversation, we can kind of look at it in 2 main categories, kind of pre-ovulation and post-ovulation. So the first day of the cycle would be the first day of the menstrual period. And what's happening hormonally on that day, and essentially, in order to determine what's happening hormonally, it's really helpful for us to understand the kind of follicular cycle. So toward the beginning of the cycle, you have a little pool of antral follicles that have been developing for several months up until this point. And so what happens toward the beginning of the cycle is eventually, as those little follicles are developing, one is chosen to become the dominant follicle. So as you're, having your menstruation and your menstruation is finishing, at some point, one of those follicles is chosen to become the dominant, and that's the one that's going to go and grow to become or grow and then ovulate. So as that follicle then starts to develop, the follicle itself is producing estrogen. And so this is what's happening as you are kind of, you're shed the functional layer of your endometrium during your menstrual period. And now that layer is being built up again because your follicle is producing estrogen. So that follicle making estrogen, the estrogen is stimulating the endometrial lining, and it's also stimulating the cervical crypts. So it's stimulating the cervix to make that cervical fluid that we were talking about. So as you're approaching ovulation during that, early part of the cycle leading up to ovulation, estrogen levels are rising, endometrial lining is developing, and and the cervical fluid, that's when we start to see it. So for a lot of women who are not on contraceptives, they might notice that there's certain days of the cycle where they kind of just feel wet. Like they might feel when they're going to the bathroom and they're wiping, it might just feel like they have to wipe several times or it's really slippery. I remember experiencing this like retrospectively as a teenager. And I remember saying something to my mom about like, what is this stuff? And she didn't know. So she was like, just use panty liners. But anyway, so that is typically, and it can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like clear, raw egg white type stretchy fluid. And so that's typically happening. And as you get closer to ovulation, your estrogen levels are rising higher and higher. And so the cervical fluid, assuming that your cycle is healthy and you have normal mucus production, would be more pronounced and you might see more of it, or it might be more of that clear, stretchy fluid around that time closest to ovulation. And so once that estrogen rises to a certain point, it's kind of like a thermostat. So one of the best analogies, one of my colleagues, Marguerite Duane, shared this analogy of, because what happens is the estrogen level rises and that sends kind of a feedback to the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. And so if the follicle was a balloon, the luteinizing hormone would be the pin. Pops it and triggers ovulation. So I love that analogy. So that's essentially, what happens leading up to ovulation. So then once you ovulate and the egg is released, that same follicle that was making all of that estrogen, it now turns into the corpus luteum and it starts to produce progesterone. So I alluded to progesterone earlier. I said that it has a thermogenic effect on the body. So progesterone rises sharply after ovulation. It shuts down typically the mucus production or significantly changes it, but typically in a healthy cycle, it shuts down mucus production. So you went from making all this lovely, slippery cervical mucus to now drying up. Also the cervical position changes during that time. And that's when the temperature shift happens as well. And so then for the second half of the cycle, the corpus luteum has a bit of a life cycle, like a limit to how long it's going to exist for. So if you are not pregnant, typically that second half of the cycle will be about 12 to 14 days. What I will say about the cycle is some of you may have noticed that I'm not saying between days one and this and between days blah, blah, blah. And the reason for that is because although the average cycle length is about 29 days, there is some variation that it's considered normal. And the first half of the cycle, that pre-ovulatory or follicular phase, that is the most variable. So if you had a woman who had, a 29-day cycle or a 34-day cycle or the 52-day cycle, the main difference would be how late ovulation took place. And of course, a healthy cycle, as I mentioned, has a range about 24 to 35 days. And some variation is normal. So if your cycle is varying less than 8 days from cycle to cycle, so if you have like a 29-day cycle sometimes, and maybe it's like a 32-day cycle, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue unless it was actually starting to vary more than about 8 days.
Wow. Okay. I think I learned everything
Are you
there.
confused?
I think I learned everything there. No, that's so okay. Lots of phases there, lots of information. So, which of those phases do you think that most people misunderstand, and what's the consequence of that? The misunderstanding some of those phases.
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's opportunities for misunderstanding at every stage. So if we look at the period, I think there's an opportunity for just kind of going back to something that we've talked about already, it's pretty normalized the different challenges that can happen in the menstrual cycle. So women, it's very common for women to have pain with menstruation, but it's not. I would say that although it's very common, that's not optimal, it's not ideal, and it can be indicative of a significant issue. So one of the misunderstandings I would say is just that we should expect our periods to be horrible and painful, and that's just something we have to put up with. And the example that I lovingly like to put into that equation is, imagine if you had a man in your life who periodically just had such severe pain in his penis that he couldn't function for like 2 days every month. No one would be like, it's totally fine. We're all good, right? We'd
Get
be
up.
like, what is actually happening? And so when we look at research,
That's great.
endometriosis is unfortunately a fairly common condition, and the average time it takes for diagnosis, this study found anywhere from 8 to 12 years from the onset of painful symptoms. And
Wow.
endometriosis can be debilitating. It's associated with infertility. It can be very complex and develop in different parts of the body. And so, yeah, that's a big
Probably.
misunderstanding
Yeah.
that it's
The big
just
difference,
Yeah.
yeah.
normal to have pain all the time.
Right.
It was funny when you were chatting really at the beginning, you kept using the word the pill. And what was going through my mind was, I bet it was a man that came up with calling that the pill. Because there are so many pills, there are so many drugs that are out there, but this one is being given the generic title, it's the pill. I don't know, I've never researched it, but after this, I'm going to go research that. How did it get and how did it become and how was it called the pill? I don't know if you know the answer to that question.
Well, I don't I don't know if I know the specific answer to exactly why we call it the pill, but there is an interesting story behind the development of the first pill. The first pill was developed and released in 1960. It was called Enovid, and it was, of course, developed by a man. What's interesting about there's a lot of things that are interesting about the pill. So I'll just share a couple things with you, but like I said, I don't know. I think my hypothesis for why they call it the pill, it could be because of just the connotation of what it was doing, maybe to
Yeah,
Mhm.
kind of. But I would say it is the very first medication that was ever developed to give to healthy people to shut down normal function in the body. Yeah,
Interesting.
okay.
Yeah.
it was the very first. So, because what is it doing? So
Yeah.
the pill suppresses ovulation, which is a healthy bodily function in healthy people. So it was literally the first medication to. It wasn't for an illness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very,
That's such an interesting way to put it.
very interesting.
yeah.
I am
Interesting,
gonna
but
I am gonna
literally true.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
yeah, you know,
it
yeah,
is
yeah.
very
Yeah,
true,
yeah, yeah.
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 No, I am
Yeah.
gonna ChatGPT that later. I'm intrigued about that. I'm giving myself a question, a task. So how can someone tell, just from the chart or charting that something's maybe off with the hormones, the thyroid, or other health systems? Give us some examples, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to kind of like any other vital sign, we have to establish that there are normal parameters. So we have to know what those normal parameters are. And then we just look for variations in that. So, the simple example of period pain, if we understood that in a normal healthy cycle, it would be optimal to have very minimal, minor to moderate, nothing more than that, then we would actually recognize pain as an issue to be investigated. If we looked at period volume and when we look at the research, typically average period volume might be 40 to 50 milliliters. Bleeding over 80 milliliters is a cause for investigation, for example. But if you don't know those parameters, as a woman, most of us we have our own periods and we just think whatever we experience is normal and we think everyone else is experiencing what we're experiencing, but no, they're not. So those are a couple of examples. But also, so if you, again, I went over the average length. Average length is about 29 days, understanding what's normal and what's not. So falling outside of those parameters, having cycles that are varying more than, 8 days, having cycles that are longer than 35 days on a consistent basis, even looking at if we break down the cycle, I mentioned normal cervical fluid patterns. So if you have, if a normal cycle, you would have 2 to 7 days of mucus leading up to ovulation, and then it would dry, as we talked about, dry up as a result of the progesterone. So if you're seeing discharge every single day, something as simple as a yeast infection or something like that could be identified. And if we're looking at the second half of the cycle, I mentioned that the corpus luteum has a bit of a life cycle. A healthy cycle, it's about 12 to 14 days between ovulation and your next period. If your luteal phase, that second half of the cycle, is 6 days or 7 days, that's a pretty big sign that there's something interfering with your progesterone production. And then with charting, a part of that for many women is taking their temperature. So we can also look at temperature patterns if they're falling in a normal range. So there's a lot of opportunity just to
Okay.
monitor different aspects of health.
Okay. And is there something that is most commonly seen? Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. I think the overall cycle length, I think that depending on what's going on with the person, it can be just very obvious. So if a person just doesn't, they're not ovulating or their cycles are really, really long. Something really common with charting, with tracking the different fertile signs, the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, is a really interesting, I suppose it's just an interesting phase of the cycle because it can tell us a lot about progesterone. So I think what's really common would be issues with progesterone, luteal phase length, potentially spotting before your period, PMS symptoms. It just becomes really apparent when you're tracking it, because then what can happen for women is you're living your best life and you're having certain symptoms, but you're not connecting it to anything because no one ever told you to track your cycle. But then as soon as you start tracking your cycle, you're noticing, okay, these patterns, it's not just random, it's actually happening when I'm in this phase of my cycle consistently. Some
mhm.
women start tracking their cycles and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I didn't realize that my migraines only happen during the menstrual phase or the premenstrual phase of my cycle. So for a lot of women, when they just start paying attention to what's happening with their cycle, they're able to kind of pin it down. And I find that, and you may have found this as well, but a lot of women who do have symptoms related to their periods or their cycles or their hormones, there's a lot of unfortunate gaslighting that takes place where you're going to the practitioner and no, it couldn't be that bad, or no, your periods couldn't be that painful, or oh, it's totally normal to have this problem, or whatever. And so when women are tracking and they're actually seeing this is cyclical, this is consistent, this is related to a certain phase of my cycle, I think for a lot of women, it just gives them maybe the confidence to know, no, it's not in your head. This is really happening. Now you have the evidence. And so you can actually get the support you need.
Yeah. I want to take a quick pause because there are a lot of different terms and options and ways to kind of track your cycle. So, fertility awareness, charting, the rhythm method, different apps. Would you mind just connecting the dots a little bit on all those things?
Sure. I mean, I'm coming from a certain perspective. I would say fertility awareness can be a bit of a general term. And
Yeah.
just that term itself could mean just that you are aware of what's happening in your cycle and your body. There's another term called body literacy. And so as a general term, it could just be that you understand how to identify ovulation in your cycle. You understand, so that kind of basic information that we talked about, like you understand cervical mucus, how it relates to ovulation. You understand that once ovulation happens, then your period may come about 12 to 14 days later. So there is some of those terms can be used in a very general way.
Hmm.
So within my world and my field, the term fertility awareness method is used kind of ubiquitously to describe the category of ways that we can track our cycle. I'm trying to think of something else that you asked, but so because it's the field that I'm in, what's interesting is that if we look at the scientific research around fertility awareness methods, so they're called in the research fertility awareness based methods. And so that would be the umbrella term if we were looking at research papers. And under that term of fertility awareness based methods, there's actually a number of different methods to actually track this. So there are some methods that would be mucus only, where there's a systems of tracking specifically designed around tracking mucus. There's other systems that are symptothermal. So I teach a version of the symptothermal method, meaning that you're adding the mucus tracking, the symptoms, you're adding the cervical position checking as an option, and the temperature. That's the symptothermal. There's other methods that are symptohormonal hormonal, where you're tracking maybe the mucus, but you're maybe using LH strips or different hormone testing to, instead of maybe focusing so much on one marker, you're actually tracking the hormones themselves as a way to track the cycle. There are also calendar methods. So the rhythm method that you mentioned, it is a real method, but that method is more of a calendar-based method where you, instead of tracking your daily signs. So the difference between kind of modern fertility awareness-based methods and the rhythm method,
Mhm.
so-called, is that modern fertility awareness-based methods typically have you tracking your signs daily. So
Okay.
I am tracking, checking for my cervical fluid each day. I'm taking my temperature each day. And so with that information, I can tell you today if I'm fertile or not based on my observations. And modern fertility awareness-based methods also have research behind them. And like I said, there's all these different kinds.
Mhm.
So if you were looking to, let's say, for example, you have a woman listening and she had really negative side effects on birth control, hormonal birth control, and she was looking for some alternative. So if she was super keen, she could look at these different fertility awareness-based methods and look at the efficacy rates. And so the methods that consistently have the highest efficacy are the symptothermal methods, the double check symptothermal methods. So she could actually say, okay, I want the highest efficacy. I want to learn. I'm going to work with somebody who teaches that type of method so I can learn that. The calendar rhythm method is, instead of kind of tracking daily, you're literally just like, okay, my cycle was 28 days. So ovulation should have happened on this day. And then you're kind of like projecting into the future, like, okay, so I should be not fertile on these other days. And so that's one of the reasons why the ongoing joke is like, well, what do you call someone who uses the rhythm method? Ha ha ha. You call them parents, right?
Yeah.
But interestingly, there are modern calendar methods that actually have research behind them. So there is actually a modern quote rhythm method called the standard days method, and there's evidence behind it. There's research based. I've interviewed a woman who taught it many years ago. So it's a really interesting field to get into, but ultimately, I think it is important to shatter some of those myths of,
Mhm.
because a lot of people just assume that fertility awareness methods don't work. They
Right.
assume that they're ineffective. And the way that a lot of people use methods that they would call, like, just, plugging your cycle into an app and then having sex when it tells you to, is not the same as studying a specific method from an instructor. So,
Sure.
um,
Yeah. So if you were a beginner, and I wanted to start with tracking one thing, what's the biomarker or the symptom that I should first start tracking?
so I feel like I would be inclined to say mucus, but before I say mucus, I would want to know, a beginner, and what is your goal?
Okay.
So if your goal is, like, if you have a good solid birth control method that you're using and your goal is just to learn more about your body, and then typically I would say mucus. If you're trying to get pregnant and you want to learn more about this method, I would say mucus. So if you are not on a hormonal birth control scenario, then you probably have already noticed. You probably just didn't pay close attention. But when you're going to the bathroom, let's say you have your period finishes, just start to pay attention as you move into that pre-ovulatory phase. Whether it's just when you go to the bathroom, you're going to pay more attention when you're wiping, or whether you're going to pay attention to what's in your underwear. You can download an app. There's gazillions of them now, and start paying attention to that. And I would say pay attention to your mucus. Your mucus, when you have those days where you're observing it, when you're seeing it, when you're noticing a slippery sensation, that is coinciding with your estrogen levels rising. And so if all you did was pay attention to when you had your mucus, if you wrote a little bit in your journal, like, oh, I saw it today, you would notice, assuming your cycles are relatively healthy, that you would see it, and then eventually it would taper off and potentially stop. If you track that for a few cycles, you could pay attention to when it stopped and how many days before your period starts. And at the most basic level, you could just use that information to predict when your period comes and to know the days, approximate days of your fertile window and your fertility. So if you were actively trying to get pregnant, then have sex on the days that you see the clear, stretchy cervical fluid before ovulation. And if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, I would say you'd want to take it a step further and work with an instructor, just to make sure that you are choosing a method with high efficacy and getting the support you need to ensure. And just for anybody who's like never heard of this before and has no idea about efficacy, So the double check symptothermal methods have efficacy, perfect use efficacy as high as 99.4%, and typical use efficacy as high as 98%. But that's a specific method. The method I mentioned, there's several different fertility awareness based methods. The typical use efficacy does range from as high as, or I guess I should say, as low as no, as high as 98%. I was trying to decide which way I wanted to say it. Um, but some of the other methods can be more like 80% or 75%. So it really depends on the actual method that you're using.
Okay.
So, what's the biggest mistake you see, beginners to this mistaking? And, and how did they learn about it? Are the books, classes, certified educators? You know, how do I stop these beginners making these mistakes, which please tell us about? And then how do they learn about it?
Yeah, the biggest mistake I see is more the kind of user error. I'm thinking in my mind of like, because I have a whole like class on this, but I think if I put it into like collectively, the biggest error that people make is rhythm method thinking. That's what I call it. And so I just mentioned that modern fertility awareness based methods are about observation. So it's actually not about predicting when you think you're going to ovulate in the future. It's mostly about observing because you're not fertile based on when you think ovulation is going to happen. You're fertile quite literally based on whether or not you're in that window. And the biggest way to identify if you're in your fertile window is whether or not you have cervical fluid, the position of your cervix. So from that observational standpoint, those are kind of two of the really big observations that we're making. But because we are in a culture that we're told that, all cycles are 28 days, and we kind of have this expectation that women are like robots and the cycles are just the same all the time. And this is kind of how the menstrual cycle is taught about in professional training programs. So I would say the biggest error is that we expect it to be like that. And so instead of actually learning how to observe and learning this new way to look at the cycle and actually like, what did I see today? Instead of understanding that ovulation could actually happen earlier or later. So ovulation does not always happen on day 14. There's a few studies that I've looked at where, ovulation happened on day 14, maybe like 10, 12, 13% of the time. Like it was not 90% of the time. So you have people that are new to the method, then they're like, I'm so excited about charting. But what they're really doing is thinking that they are always going to ovulate on day 14
Mm,
and then making decisions based on that expectation that ovulation is going to happen around that time.
sure.
I would say that honestly, I've been in the field for so long, and I recognize that so many people like fertility awareness is definitely it's the underdog. And it's not when even recent studies I've been talking about on my podcast and my work, there's still a really heavily negative perception about fertility awareness based methods. So what I want is for people who want to use it and who maybe, like I said, had a negative experience with hormonal birth control, I want them to be successful. So if we're wanting that success, if this is something that's resonating with you and you're thinking, I would love to learn more about these non-hormonal fertility awareness methods, I didn't even know this was an option, I would just recommend working with an instructor, research a little bit about the different kinds of methods, learn a little bit more about the efficacy. We are living in an amazing time now where there's so much more information than I had when I first started. I think for the most part, it's easier to find information about it, but to be successful, highly recommend even a few sessions with an instructor who's trained in the method that you want to be using.
Sure. So which lifestyle factors have you noticed have the biggest impact on cycle health?
That is a great question. I would certainly say nutrition plays a really big role. Lily and I talk a lot about when we were writing Real Food for Fertility. I mean, that was obviously a central piece of the book, but I would say nutrition, under eating and over exercise, the cycle is very sensitive to that. So interestingly, that's one of the most common things that I see happening in various populations, and I think that it's very common for women to inadvertently undereat, not even to say that they're absolutely trying to. I mean, obviously that can happen too. But if you think about it, when to go into stereotypical gender expectations for a moment, if a woman is exercising, often she's trying to get lean. That's why she's exercising. And when men are exercising, often they're trying to bulk up. and build muscle. I'm not saying that's always the case, but so what I've noticed with clients is that when they're working out even a lot, they might not even consider that it's a lot because I find exercisers tend to have a different expectation. I mean, I can relate to that. I was heavily involved in sports in school. And so it took me a long time to realize walking was exercise. But when we're looking at the cycle, you see how the cycle will respond. So I would say nutrition, under eating, exercising, but not eating a sufficient amount to account for that. And one of the great things about charting in the cycle when we're looking at it as a vital sign is that it really cuts through the noise. So regardless of whether you think you're eating enough or, whatever your opinions are, we can actually just have you track your cycle. And as I mentioned, if your luteal phase is too short or if we're seeing delayed ovulation, I mean, the cycle really speaks for itself. I think one of the things that Lily and I wrote a few times in Real Food for Fertility was, the cycle doesn't lie. So it's like, you can really gauge what your body needs by paying attention to what's happening in your cycle. And if it's out of alignment, learning what you have to do or how much you need to eat or how you need to structure your diet in order to get those parameters in line, that's typically invaluable information. And it's often a lot more than people think.
Mhm.
The All Well Code Network is full of exercises. It's full of strength and conditioning coaches. It's full of chiropractors, nutritionalists, wellness professionals. They are actively encouraging women, particularly, to eat a lot more protein. They're actively encouraging you to jump in a cold pool and freeze yourself. They're actively encouraging you then to jump into a sauna and get red light. So these modern fitness trends, eating a lot of protein, maybe excessive protein, jumping in cold pools, getting in red light therapy, how do they affect the whole cycle?
Well, that's such a great question. One of
That's
the
two I've
things
done today.
Great job,
That's
Andy.
two I've done. Two great
2 great
questions today.
questions.
That's
you're on a
more than
roll.
normal.
Well, I love that question. Again, I'm coming from a certain perspective as well, because I've spent 2 decades watching the menstrual cycle in hundreds, if not thousands of women, right? So I think what makes this approach unique is that it takes it out of this idea that there's this one thing that's going to work for everybody or everyone's the same. So I do find in the health space that people get on these things where they're like,
Hmm.
okay, everyone needs
Yeah.
to do this thing, right? So when you have women tracking their cycles, you get to see on an individual basis whether or not what they're doing is actually working. And so what that means is that you'll have some women who will have to eat more protein to get their results. And other women could be, getting results on a slightly different. I mean, we're all different sizes. We have different body composition, right? Different metabolism to some degree. But I think that's one thing where yes, protein is certainly that's definitely one of the things that we talk about a lot. Protein has the most significant thermogenic effect in the body. And I feel like a lot of women are just, for whatever reason, we're under eating protein. And it's a very common conversation. My main focus these days, I have a practitioner program. We have our fertility awareness mastery mentorship for women's health professionals. And so I spend a lot of my days now training women's health professionals to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool. And a big piece of what we talk about is that nutrition component, and obviously it's not only protein. We also need healthy fats in order to make hormones. So we do need to talk about balancing the macronutrients. And we also need to talk about getting sufficient micronutrients to support all of the different body processes that are involved. In terms of what you said about the cold plunges and the sauna, I think that's an interesting topic because I mean, I would never say that there is one answer for all of the people, but just as a interesting note on that, I have seen women who regularly do cold plunges. I have seen it potentially have a negative impact on the cycle, potentially increasing the
Oh.
stress, potentially, when they and I encourage people to experiment because this is one of the wonderful things about cycle tracking. So if I'm working with a client and let's say they're noticing that their luteal phase is short, they've got some PMS symptoms, some signs of low progesterone, we look at all of the different factors. And if they're doing everything right, but they're still not seeing the results they're looking for, I might suggest something like, okay, well, why don't we just have one cycle where you skip the cold plunges and then, bring them back in the following cycle and see what happens. And at the end of the day, that it's not about whether I think it's right or not, but I have had clients legitimately in that situation where they realized that something that they were doing that they really thought was helping was having a different effect on their hormones than they anticipated. But like I said, there's one way to find out. It's not about my opinion. And that's what I love about charting, because it's not about what I think. It's
Yeah.
about what
Yeah.
literally is happening in the cycle.
And where it works for you. I really like that you said that because everyone's different.
Very different. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there key labs or medical conversations you recommend alongside charting?
I mean, absolutely. I think that with charting, it's a really interesting modality because it can really inform what types of testing that you might want to do.
Mhm.
So I think that when practitioners are operating outside of the cycle, then they often have to start with a whole bunch of lab tests to determine what's happening hormonally. Like if you're not working within the cycle, then in order to establish any type of baseline, you're going to have to run all kinds of labs just to kind of figure out where we're starting from. So what I appreciate about the cycle and charting and looking at it in this way is that you can have your client chart and you can kind of see what's working and what's not. So instead of maybe having to use every possible, lab at the very beginning to determine what's happening hormonally, you can kind of get a lay of the land, and then you can apply specific testing based on what you're seeing. So that's certainly one application of it. And something also that I should mention is that a lot of hormone lab testing is date based. So they'll tell you to do something on day 14 or day 21. And all
Right.
of that is based on this assumption that ovulation is always happening on day 14, which it is not. And
Right.
so, one of the things, just from a practical standpoint, as far as hormone testing goes, if you have your clients and they're charting and you're looking for hormone specific testing that is supposed to be related to certain phases of the menstrual cycle, then it would make a whole lot of sense to have them chart. So instead of arbitrarily doing it on day 14, when maybe your client ovulated on day 12, or maybe they are not even ovulating until day 19 or something, to get more accurate results.
So let's try to pull this together and see if I've got this right and see if I've listened correctly, Lisa. Is that so? At the very beginning, when you were talking about how you got into this and you were talking about your approach, you in essence were given the pill to try to fix your problems. Okay, so how can people use this charting to advocate for themselves in that healthcare setting and almost push back if that is the solution that they're given?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think what charting can do for women, I alluded to it a little bit earlier as well, is that it can it provides data. So from a very practical standpoint, it takes all of the things that you're feeling and experiencing out of your head and it puts it onto paper so that you can actually start to find and establish trends. So from that standpoint of trying to advocate for yourself, you often have to speak their language. If you just say irregular cycle, they're just writing your prescription. But if you have actual data, I have another thought, but I'll save it until a little bit later. But if you have the actual data and you're going in saying my cycle lengths, like the last 6 cycles have been over 50 days, right? It's a little bit different and you are likely to get a bit of a different response than if what you're saying is a little bit more vague. If you're tracking your periods and you're making a point of tracking your, estimating the blood loss or the volume, or you're just saying, I filled 6 pads in one day, and you can chat GPT like the estimated blood volume in a pad or whatever. Like, so you can be more specific, right? So it's different to say my periods are heavy versus to say I soaked 6 super tampons in 3 hours. And that's what happens on the first day of every period. And I estimated that, right? So I do think there's value in that. Secondly, I think there's a certain level of confidence that women who chart their cycles have. So whereas before you charted your cycles, you would have doubted yourself. You would have gone with kind of maybe that vague explanation of what you think is wrong. And then the practitioner could say something like, well, that's totally fine, or that's not a problem, or just dismiss it or whatever. Before you actually started tracking, you might have just, like put your head down and just gone home. But if you've been tracking your cycle for 6 months and you can see that there's a specific issue that keeps showing up every cycle at this time, then you're less likely to take no for an answer. So I think the one challenge that I wanted to mention is that most health practitioners are not trained to track cycles. Tracking cycles is not a thing that is taught in med school.
That's cool.
It's
Yeah.
not a thing that's taught in other programs either. It's not a thing that's taught extensively, even in like midwifery school or nursing school. And so most practitioners who have this additional specific knowledge of how to chart cycles had to take an additional training outside of their regular training. So one of the potential downfalls or challenges is that women who start tracking their cycles very enthusiastic, very excited, it's very empowering. And so they want to be able to take their charts to their doctor or their practitioner who has never been trained to read them and who might just kind of be like, I don't need to see that. Or they might get discouraged
Yeah.
if their practitioner is not encouraging or supportive or doesn't even want to see what they're charting. So anyways, I wanted to say that piece, but in terms of advocating for yourself, data is helpful. Try to talk their language. Try to quantify what you've seen. Try to provide specifics. If it's irregular cycles, if it's bleeding, even if it's abnormal bleeding or spotting, how many days, for how long, how many cycles have you seen this? Try to be as accurate as possible. But I would say a few other practical things. If you've had difficulties with your practitioner in the past, if you've ever had issues with that person not believing you or not minimizing your concerns, go with somebody if you can. Go with a friend, a cousin, a partner. And I know it's dumb. We shouldn't have to take our friend with us to the practitioner, like to the doctor's office, right? But that's one option. And the other thing is if you're not being listened to, if you're not being supported, find someone who will support you. So I'll just give an analogy because I love giving analogies. If you went to a hairdresser, you know where I'm going with this, and they like chopped off all your hair, you're not going back. Like you're just being like, you're bad. And you're going to find someone else.
Right.
But for whatever reason, if our doctor or our healthcare practitioner sometimes isn't supporting us in that way or whatever, maybe you have a relationship with this person. Maybe they've been your doctor since you were 3 years old, but women's health issues are a specialized thing. So your general practitioner may be amazing, but do they specialize in endo if that's what you have? Do they specialize in PCOS? Do they specialize in hormone health? So the other thing too is if you really want to have success, like we have to build up the confidence, we have to provide the data, but we also are going to get better results if we go to the person who specializes in the thing, does it all day. That's what all of their clients do. You're going to get a lot better results from going to the person that actually specializes in it.
Sure. What advice do you give to partners or parents who want to support psycholiteracy?
That's a great question too. I don't know if I've been asked it in that exact way. I mean, I typically don't have to give advice to partners because they're often very supportive. But,
Great.
it's my experience has been that if you're in a relationship with a man, he wants your hormones to be balanced because when they are, you have a sex drive and you feel good. Your period comes and you're not in a bad mood. Like, you know what I mean? Like I feel like there's a lot of very practical reasons. And also, if you're with a supportive partner, he probably loves you and wants you to feel good. And so I would just say that just be open, I guess, to the conversation, just like you are here today, right? Like we're having this conversation, you're open to it. You don't have to make it your whole new pastime, but I think it's helpful to just be supportive. For parents, I think it's just important to start having these conversations to give opportunity to discuss. And I would say also for parents, don't be scared of it. I find it really amusing. One of the questions I always get is like, what about teens, Lisa? Do you recommend fertility awareness for teens? And then there's like the blinking, right? Expecting me to say something interesting. Fertility awareness, because we're adults, we're having a conversation about using it as an option for birth control and things like that. I've often said that for teens, I mean, if teens are sexually active, condoms prevent STIs. I don't even know what we're talking about here. I'm not a fan of where the direction has gone to not even talk about condoms anymore. But far be it from that, for the conversation around parents and teens, talking about the menstrual cycle, talking about charting, talking about cervical fluid, it does not necessarily, like, it doesn't mean that we're saying that they need to use it for birth control. There's age appropriate ways to talk about charting. And from a very practical standpoint, I know when I was, other than the pain and all of that, I remember I had a subscription to YM magazine. I don't know if anyone remembers that YM magazine. And there was always this section about, I forget what it was called, but it was like these embarrassing moments, but every moment was the period thing. Every embarrassing moment in that magazine was like, oh, I got my period, I didn't know. And so even from a most practical perspective, if we all could teach our daughters about cervical fluid and how it's related to ovulation and how ovulation is how we make hormones. And if we just talked about the cycle and we talked about the different phases of the cycle and how our attention and energy could shift around those times. And so just had an open conversation in a positive way and how ovulation is how we make our hormones and how it can, have an effect on how we feel. But if we track our cervical fluid and teaching them that it's normal so they don't think they have an infection every time they have ovulation, when we identify that cervical fluid, we can predict our periods. I mean, imagine if you were a teenager and somebody told you this amazing superpower that you have in your panties, that you could predict your period so you wouldn't have to be surprised or scared that you might get your period and you didn't know that it was coming. So I think there's a lot of really positive ways that we can present this to our children and have conversations with our partners and our friends and just learn more about it, regardless of whether or not you ever want to use it as a method.
Yeah, sure. Love it. So before we wrap up, we have something we've just added called our rapid fire. So 20 seconds or less for each question. And here we go. So what's one practice you wish everyone with a cycle would start tomorrow? I think I know this answer, but
Check their mucus.
one misconception you'd love to see disappear.
That the pill regulates the menstrual cycle.
One underrated benefit of fertility awareness.
I would say confidence and really developing a closeness and a deep understanding of the connection between your body and your health.
Lisa, this one's going to be controversial. I don't believe you that men listen, really care. I don't believe you that they are really as supportive as you can. So how would you, if I'm correct, get them to be more supportive?
So I do disagree, and I feel like it's surprising, but I might have thought that at some point when I was younger, but all these years of working with men, most of them care. I would just tell them the truth about your symptoms. I would tell them the truth about what you've been dealing with. If this is an issue for somebody and this is not short, sorry, but if this is an issue in your relationship, then it's probably because you've been struggling with something and you need to just be upfront and honest and don't be shy to be honest about whatever it is. If you're in pain, if you are experiencing hormonal fluctuations, whatever, just be honest. And if he doesn't listen, then you probably are with the wrong guy.
It wasn't necessarily what I believed, but I was really fascinated to hear your answer. Okay, you mentioned a few times book, book, book. Come on, tell us about your book.
Right. Well, my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, it really goes deep into a lot of the things we talked about. So obviously the title of the book indicates that I'm making the argument that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign that we should be paying attention to. And so I go into a ton of detail. The mucus chapter is wild. It really surprises people because there's so much science behind it. I think people are not prepared for that. So if you're wanting to learn more about charting specifically and, that rabbit hole, whether it's for birth control or conception, the fifth vital sign. My latest book that I co-authored with Lily Nichols, Real Food for Fertility, as I mentioned, we put our minds together. So Lily is just a powerhouse when it comes to nutrition. And she wanted to write a book specifically for fertility, for the preconception phase. Because what was happening is women were coming to her, they had read Real Food for Pregnancy, and they're saying, okay, so what do? I want to prepare for conception or whatever the case. And she would recommend my book. And then when I was in the same situation when women were asking me for preconception nutrition, I would say, okay, read Real Food for Pregnancy, but I know I know you're not pregnant yet, right? Or even women who were wanting to normalize their cycle, not necessarily even trying to conceive, but just normalize hormones. So we put our minds together and so Real Food Fertility for Fertility, because it's focused more on the preconception piece, the fertility awareness information is more so specific to conception. So there's a lot of information there about using fertility awareness strategies to conceive alongside the nutritional information. We have chapters on egg and sperm quality and PCOS, hypothalamic amenorrhea, fibroids, endometriosis. It really goes a lot deeper.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Great. Usual places, Amazon, etc. You can find those books.
Yes, Amazon. We did they're audiobooks for both, and Lily and I actually recorded the audiobook together.
How fun.
Great.
Yeah, it was so fun. We were shocked. I don't want to scare anyone off, but it was like 19 hours of audio
Yeah.
because
I'm
it's
sure.
basically 2 books in a book. But it was a lot of fun. Lots of interesting, obviously, information and all of that good stuff.
Right. Okay, we always like to wrap up this podcast with kind of our core values. So our core values are strength, kindness, and perspective. Is there anybody that you want to give out a shout that embodies these values? Someone who's deeply influenced you or inspired your journey? Show a bit of kindness and give them a shout out, please.
That's such a great question. There's so many people. I
You're
mean,
only allowed one.
I'm only allowed one.
You're only allowed one. And we know it's your mother, but other than that.
Oh, that's so hard. I'm going to go the easy route. I'm going to say Lily. because why not? Because our work is so complementary, and I really just do admire her. We share a passion and drive for supporting women on their journeys, and a big part of my passion and focus is a lot of us want to become mothers at some point, giving a roadmap and filling in all those gaps that we weren't taught.